Thanks for staying with us for the third and final session today. This session is the one I'm probably most excited about in the fact that I have absolutely no idea where we're going to end up with our conversations. Foray is very excited about the fact that we're talking about a 20th anniversary, the fact that this has happened. I don't think any of our original members necessarily thought that something happening 20 years later was going to happen, and the fact that we're sitting here at a panel and perhaps talking about what will happen at our 40th anniversary is even a bit more exciting. This panel is supported by the Power Institute. The Power Institute is our partner, of course, in today's entire symposium, and I'd like to make a special mention again of Mark, but also Stephen, who's on the end here, who has been incredibly supportive and has taken to celebrating our 20th as if it's their own 20th. So it's been really, really great to be working with such a supportive and fun organisation. But this session is also about our collaborations. We work with many, many people, from the personal to the collective to institutions in both, Sydney, wider Sydney, across New South Wales, Australia-wide and internationally. And it really shows, I think, the patterns of engagement that we hope should be happening across Australia generally through all facets of society. This year coming, I'm going to go through our sort of program, which I'm sure you've all picked up along today. Next year, our program really does look a bit more nationally, and we're also working in Beijing, Karachi, Sharjah and Hong Kong, which we've so far confirmed for next year. And I think this role that Foray plays in advocating what great Australian talent that we have here overseas is something that we've worked a lot with Alex and the City of Sydney to do over the last 20 years, and I think it's really part of what our future should be. So this sort of diverse panel of Foray collaborators illustrate, I think, our current new direction in which we're going with Abdullah. Pedro's going to talk a bit more and pick up where John left off in terms of critical thinking and critical writing and how we need that as well as we need the art itself. And then with our sort of two of our institutional partners and government partners in City of Sydney and University of Sydney. So I'm going to do some intros. Dr. Stephen Whiteman is a lecturer in Asian art, art history and film studies, School of Letters, Art and Media at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Sydney. He holds a degree in art history with East Asian Studies from Brown University, where he earned his AB, and Stanford University, where he received his MA and his PhD. Before joining the faculty at the University of Sydney, he taught art and architectural history of Asia at the University of Pennsylvania, Middlebury College and the University of Colorado. Stephen is a great supporter of 4A, and I think ever since I arrived, he's been in almost every single event. He always books a babysitter when we're having a party. He's been instrumental to the realisation of today's symposium, and I look forward to what is, one of our first really sort of larger events, and what we've been talking about is taking over the world in the next few years. Yeah. Alex Bowen heads up the cultural and creative programs at the City of Sydney, encompassing the city's network of 9 libraries, Customs House, Pine Street Creative Arts Centre, cultural development, business development, sponsorship and major events including New Year's Eve, Art and About and the Lunar New Year celebrations. Foray is very lucky to be supported and housed by the City of Sydney since its founding, and continues to work at the city to create a dynamic cultural global city and promote our artists through our events in Asia. And I just realised I haven't been doing the... Oh. A moment. There's Stephen. I think I missed talking about the fact that there's going to be a new museum here at the University of Sydney. There's some artist impressions of it, and I think will come up a little bit in our conversation today. There's Alex. And some of the images for Alex are sort of illustrating how long our involvement has been with the City of Sydney. Here is our 2001 Chinese New Year parade, which we always took part in. I think that's Darchi holding the banner. Young Jung Group performance as part of the 2015 Chinese New Year Festival here at the Chinese Garden of Friendship. And also some of our international things we've done in partnership with the city. So we've got Shanghai Biennale, and then also just recently is Clover Moore here with Trevor and Lucas in Guangzhou. And it was the hottest day that has ever been. I think every single photo of Pedro and I, we're sweating, and then Clover's in a suit, and she's just a miracle. Yeah. She's amazing. Here's Pedro.
Magazine says we need a photo. Let's need a rubbish bin.
Pedro has been Foray's program manager since 2012, and he's produced and curated numerous exhibitions. But even more than this, he's a prolific writer. His writing can be found in Art Asia Pacific, Un Magazine, Broadsheet Journal, Art Monthly Australasia, Photophile, to name a few. And today we're launching The 4A paper is an online journal which Pedro is the editor, and today, it's marking the first time we're dedicating some money and some time to a really sustained critical conversation in writing that is available for everybody, and it's been quite a big passion since the beginning of the year working on that. Next to me, I have Dr. Abdullah M.I. Syed. He was born in Karachi in Pakistan and presently works between, I've written here Karachi and Sydney, but I've got to add in New York as well. His artworks utilise a variety of mediums and techniques to communicate complex political ideas. This includes print screening and the shadow play produced with dollar bills and razor blades. His political commentary tackles controversial topics such as the war on terror, immigration and Western attitudes towards the East. Abdullah has actually been working with us for the last 2 years, and kind of in a sort of triptych series. It didn't start out like that, but kind of has become that. In 2015, he was part of the 48-hour incident where he did a performance piece. We then worked and extended that for Art Central Hong Kong this year, where he won the best performance piece of the whole week. Of all sites in Hong Kong, and we're currently working on the the next edition for Melbourne as M Pavilion as part of Asia Topa in February next year.
Just answer my question.
Sorry. Here's Pedro hanging out, in Lung Li recently, and then also with Anthony just before the opening of Sea Pearl White Cloud in Guangzhou. Here's Abdullah. There he is in Hong Kong. And then I thought, just so you get an idea of my role at 4A, I think a lot of our work is about advocacy, and I think sometimes people don't really see that. And this year we spent a lot of time doing some field work. I can't really see because of the slide here, but we gave a lot of talks in every single art school in Pakistan that Abdullah helped me organise about what 4A does and what a artist-run and smaller arts organisation can do and provide for artists. And then the bottom one here is at Jogja, in Ace House Collective in Jogja, when I was working with a few of the artists there ahead of our show that's on now, Jogja Calling. So this session is really about thinking about what 4A does or should be doing. We sort of skirted around this in the last few sessions about the sort of responsibilities, and I think it's really interesting hearing artists speak about what we should be doing and how they think we should be thinking about things, and it's something that we take very much into consideration. But I think we also work with other organisations in the City of Sydney, as well as sort of wider Sydney and Australia, about what we're doing to really make this a dynamic cultural city, a cultural nation, how we reflect that internationally and how we make Australians appear as an image internationally as possibly and definitely ethnically Australian, ethnically Asian as well. So I thought I'd start off today with perhaps each of you, because it comes from such a diverse group, saying how both professionally and personally you're involved with 4A and why you think we play an important role within the wider sphere. And Abdullah, because you sat next to me, you can start.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me for this panel. It's a privilege and honor. My association with 4A started, as Michaela said, 2 years ago. But I was aware of 4A back in, I think, 2008 and 2009. That was the first time I became aware of 4A, despite the fact that I migrated here in 2006. And I think it was a show by another Pakistani artist, Nusra Latif Qureshi, I believe. And I think I saw that show and I said, okay, so there is a gallery here who bring these artists from different cultures. And I think then I become more involved in that sense that I started to visit the gallery more often to see the show. But it was 2 years ago when I was at Artist in Resident in Paramount Artist Studios when curators from 4A visited and they discovered me. And I use the word discovery here and not just lightly. It's very important to me because that's how I see the role of 4A. It's an institution that actually discovers talent in many ways, and I'm not sure whether I'm talented enough to be discovered or not, but one of the curators at that time, who's not with 4A, Toby Chapman, he invited me to exhibit with him for this fantastic project called 48 Hours Mass Incident. And although I'm not recognized for my performance and I don't do that much performances, he encouraged me and he said, no, I think you should do this one particular performance which he saw. And he said, let's put this particular performance in the show. And it was an amazing experience because not only I got the encouragement from them to do this particular performance, but also there's a particular support that actually goes beyond that. Later on, then he invited me to exhibit some of my other works in another project called Future Archaeologies, which was an interesting project as well. And I think from there, we end up taking those performances, the performance that I did, to Hong Kong. And hopefully we are taking that same performance, but again, we are evolving it next year for Asia Topa in Melbourne. So I think as I said that, I think it's about the discovery in that sense. But the other aspect which was quite illuminating for me is that I think there's a lot of dialogue about center and periphery that happens with the institution. And although I know that those are no longer applicable or people don't discuss them, I actually find 4A as an institution who really helped delineating and also almost obliterating that distinction, particularly for me, because they are at the center, but they are also bringing artists from all walks of life, and not just only in Sydney, but also they're inviting artists from abroad as well, the international artists. And initially I consider myself as an international artist for a long time. I've been here for 10 years, but it's only in the last 3 years that I can see myself as part of Sydney and maybe part of Australian art culture. Because I think now, in those 3 years after exhibiting with 4A, I feel that people actually at least aware of my art practice and what I do. So that awareness is probably the best part for me to be part of 4A.
Hi, my name is Pedro de Almeida, and I'm not Asian Australian. It's like an AA meeting. Get a drink. A preamble, if my voice falters or my eyes tear up or I start to shake, it's not because I'm nervous public speaking, because I am blessed or cursed with a superabundant ego, but because I was up till 3 a.m. putting the 4A papers to bed. So check it out at 4a.com.au/4a-papers. Lots of fights over the URL anyway. This will sound like a long story, but it's not. I'll be brief. But a little bit about myself, which I think is important because, as Michaela mentioned, the personal is professional and the professional is political, and the cycle keeps going. And also, I guess, answering the question of how I came to work at 4A. So I'm 4A's program manager since 2012. I've been really fortunate I've had a few roles in arts and culture and publishing and other things since going to art school a long time ago. But I've been really fortunate to work for 2 organisations that really reflect what I'm interested in terms of certain kind of politics and representation around multiculturalism and other things, being Campbelltown Arts Centre, where I was program manager from 2008 to 2011, when Lisa Havilah was director, and 4A since 2012, as I mentioned. I'm particularly passionate about those things because essentially my background is I immigrated to Australia in 1983. I was born in Portugal. My parents left with a few suitcases. As migrants, we arrived at the Pennington Migrant Hostel, a very significant hostel in Australia's history that I think actually probably processed the majority of migrants, post-war migrants in Australia, hundreds of thousands. It's in the suburb of Pennington in Adelaide, which I got to visit for the first time earlier this year. We migrated essentially because my parents were kind of fed up with the backwash of the longest-running fascist government in Europe, which people tend to forget, in Portugal, being from 1928 to 1975, although the Portuguese won't forget. I arrived at a time where we're probably the very few European migrants who went through that hostel at that time. Obviously, post-war, the hostel was kind of made of Nissan huts, of surplus Nissan huts from the Pacific War. Was obviously most of the migrants were from Eastern Europe and those sorts of places. By the time we arrived in 1983, based on photographs that we have of sort of standing outside those Nissan huts, it's mostly children my age, 3, 4, 5 years old, from Southeast Asia, clearly a lot of Cambodians, Vietnamese, being the early 1980s. Kids dressed with not much in thongs and t-shirts, and I was the only one who inexplicably had suspenders and a bow tie. And really nice shoes, because the patron saint of my hometown is the guardian of quality footwear. Which is true. There's a big bronze sculpture with cobblers doing their thing. Forever a working class hero fixing shoes. So that's, I guess, my background. Asia's important to me. Sounds like a ridiculous kind of crass statement, but I think all those stories of migration are really important. My beautiful 3-year-old son, who has amazing red hair, is one generation removed from, of course, his late grandfather, who arrived in this country as a refugee from the Vietnam War, who passed away a long time ago, who actually left Vietnam on a boat and was processed like Darchi Dung in Pulau Budong in Malaysia. So these sorts of narratives are really important to me. Working at 4A is fabulous because it's somewhere where you really don't, of course we're professional, but it's somewhere where you really don't, first job I've had ever really, where there's not another version of me turning up at work, which is a boon for me and insufferable for everyone else, I'm sure, because there's very little editing. I sort of began to work at 4A at Campbelltown. We did a really significant project, which a lot of you are probably aware of, called Edge of Elsewhere, which was curated by Aaron, Lisa Havilah and Thomas Burgess, who was the former lecturer here of Asian Art, Sydney University. Phenomenal project that went over 3 years, from 2010, 11, 12, in partnership with the Sydney Festival, commissioning artists from Australia, Asia and the Pacific to work in partnership with Sydney communities. So there was people like Darchi, like Pap Tuan, Wang Zhanwei, Neil Harry, Brooke Andrew, Richard Bell, many others. So yeah, we got to work in partnership with 4A, lots of meetings throughout the year, lots of engagement. So I got to know Aaron very well. So an opportunity came up when Summer Hipworth, my predecessor, who made a really big contribution as 4A's former program manager for 4-5 years I'm guessing, before me, who can't be here because she's travelling. I came on board, very casually, which is great. I think it was a beer at a pub in Newtown with Aaron. And I checked my tax return. I think I paid for that beer. Which set the tone, because when I started, I also paid for my chair and my mouse. Which I continually remind people, because now that we have increased multi-year public funding, interns, they get chairs, right? I didn't have a chair, okay?
Yeah, hard act to follow. Hi, I'm Alex from the City, Executive Manager, Creative City. And as Michaela had introduced, my team does extraordinary projects and events and programs at the City. And obviously we're deadly passionate about the City of Sydney and all the cultural organisations that reside in there. But also all the artists and the community of users that we have that come to the city and use our city. So pretty big advocates for it. We want to have a global city, we want to have a really vibrant city, and it's organisations like Gallery 4A that we think contribute to that vibrancy and that point of difference. We have supported Gallery 4A for quite a while, and I can see Aaron here, and I actually was trying to remember when I first went to a 4A show, but it was most probably somewhere near the beginning of its time, and reading the sort of preamble about Pauline Hanson and 20 years ago, and now she's back again, is just extraordinary to think that it's been only 20 years. I think one of the things with Gallery 4A in the city is that if you hadn't visited the site, you would think that you were dealing with quite a large institution physically. And I think that's why they're so extraordinary, that when you do go there, they're above a ramen shop and a Hello Kitty store, don't start us, and they're doing the best they can in the space that they have in Sydney. But then we know that they have arms and tentacles that are going all over the world, which I find extraordinary. And you would never guess its modesty in Haymarket. And so one of the big passions that we would have at the city, and we've had this conversation with previous directors, was, how can we help this organisation physically become what it should be in Sydney. It's located in Haymarket, is critically important for that area. It's important for Sydney to remind ourselves where we are in the world. There is so much development happening down that neck of the woods now that it's almost changing every day. And I think Gallery 4A responds to those changes and responds to the changes globally, and that's really important. And when I think back at some of the projects that occurred over the years that the city was able to support, things like Cinema Alley, where they started to bring out onto the street what was happening inside and really engaging people to come and participate in film on the streets. It's such a simple concept, but very successful. The walking apps through Chinatown, helping us activate our sister city relationship with Guangzhou was very, very important, and the Lord Mayor can only speak positive, flourishing words to, I think, what she thinks is about 12 staff members, which is mostly what, you're 11 and you're 1. It's what your equal output. I think that it's that your success is almost your failure as well, because you just get on and do it. And I think for the city, we need that vibrancy. We need cultural organisations where anybody walking past can come in and discover something new, be amazed, be surprised or shocked. And I think that happens in times when we have the Biennale of Sydney in town, and 4A has always put on something that's quite challenging or opportunistic to be part of that moment in Sydney. And we can only see amazing things coming forward. So I'm a huge fan, I have always been. And it's fantastic to have Michaela on board, and it was a great privilege to sort of be part of that process, to see you come on board as well, and you've just gone for it. Yeah, I'm sure it's been interesting, or dynamic is the word. But yeah, we're going to work really hard with 4A and try and get them the sort of physical space that they need. But also we want to work with them on projects going forward. We really need to do those projects every now and again and leverage that opportunity. You know, and the Shanghai opportunity that Aaron came to us, in fact, was my first month at the city. I want to go to Shanghai. Oh, okay. I'll put that to council, and there you go. Off you went. So we were really happy to support that as well. And it's great to be here, and I'm sorry I haven't been here all day, but it's a fantastic turnout as well. And it's just so lovely to see so many people who have been associated with the organisation for so long. And that, you know, that's a really rare asset to have. I'm pretty sure not many organisations can have that. And just the fact that we're sitting here and we can recognise so many. So congratulations.
I'm getting over just a cough. My name's Stephen White. Michaela introduced me a moment ago. I'm the lecturer in Asian art here at the university, which is in and of itself a sort of, it feels like a very daunting responsibility at times, because Sydney has had such a long and prominent tradition of Asian art study and Asian art research. I haven't been in Sydney very long. I've been here about 2.5 years, and my relationship with 4A, which is in a sense what we were asked to sort of introduce, is substantially perspective. I mean, it is. I have been, as Michaela said, a avid consumer of gold coin beers at openings and various other fun things, and been a great sort of enjoyer and admirer of what 4A has done. But we've only really recently started to think very actively about what our future partnerships might look like. And so for me, I guess I want to a little bit follow Pedro's lead and talk a little bit about personally about why this partnership is very important for me. I'm trained as an art historian, and actually as a pre-modern or early modern art historian. I'm a historian substantially, at least at the moment, of Ming and Qing China. And I foreground that first because art history as a discipline has been somewhat absent in today's conversation. I even heard from Pedro that there had been a certain sort of latent hostility towards academic study, and which is totally fine. And I don't say that because I want to sort of reassert the importance of art history, but rather sort of assert the idea that art history ought to be a sort of active part, ought to want for itself to be an active part of conversations like today's. And art history is sort of a very conservative discipline in many, many regards, actually particularly in Australia. But that would be unfair to the conservatism of art history in the US too, where it's quite conservative. And so for me, when I first arrived at 4A, I saw an opportunity for teaching and engagement that I found very exciting. The first time Michaela and I met was when I brought students from our Masters of Art Curating to hear about the activities of 4A. I was very eager to expose my students not only to this sort of very active organization, but also to the idea of an organization, an arts organization that took community engagement as a central part of its practice. That's not just a Asian art or Asian Australian art thing. I think that arts organizations, I want to be training curators who are looking to their communities. I want to be supporting curators who are looking to their communities for their work. That was also the first time that I'd ever heard of Pauline Hanson, which I know is sort of surprising in this room, but nevertheless, as an American, I didn't know who, I was too distracted by our own folks back home, I guess. And I was very interested also in this sort of politicization, this sort of shared sense that there was a political motive or origin for 4A that I found very intriguing. When I work on court art, and like imperial art in China, and I was very conscious when I was working on my dissertation that I was choosing a topic that was about trying to unpack the nature of how power embeds itself and hides itself and encodes itself in art, and how propaganda operates inside pretty pictures that aren't supposed to be propagandistic, and how sort of the fist exists within the velvet glove. And that was always a sort of politicized agenda for me. And as I sort of continued on into my teaching, I became more and more convinced that my research aside, I needed in my teaching and my professional life to find a broader context for what I was teaching, to find a broader agenda. I became more and more interested in the idea that art history, instead of being a conservative field, could be a activist field, could be an anti-racist field, could be a discipline that was out trying to speak about the human condition in a particular way that I wanted to be a part of and to think about. And so for me, when I encountered 4A and became really familiar with 4A, or became more familiar with 4A, I became really interested in learning about how 4A had been doing this work, and finding out how a place like the University of Sydney and art history at the University of Sydney could start to find common cause, and really can indeed learn from 4A in terms of how we were doing some of this work. So I guess that's about it. We'll address other things, I suppose. We go along.
I mean, it's really interesting hearing about these different kind of avenues. They're all, again, like all the artists, with a personal association. I think the idea of activism is something we still talk about, this political nature. And when 4A first began, it was a totally different environment. In fact, they had $7,000 they had raised from a private funder. They had, amazingly, with $7,000 contiguous space in Haymarket on Sussex Street. We had a space, and the second exhibition was actually called Asian Australian Artists Against Racism. Quite overtly political. Time has changed in that 20 years, and now, as of last year, we are a funded contemporary art organisation to the degree of, places like Art Space here, or IMA in Brisbane, or Gertrude in Melbourne. And what that means is that we suddenly fit into other people's strategies. And for us, and I think it's quite interesting, Pedro and I discuss this all the time, is that when you fit into other people's strategies, how do you still remain political in the way that you want to work, or the way we want to support artists? And I'm interested, Stephen, that attracts you to working with somewhere like 4A. But I can imagine, Alex, you're like, or I don't do that. I mean, are these things that both of you consider when you're looking at somewhere like us? We're kind of not a genuine run-of-the-mill art space. We're quite different. So But does that really change, or is that how you want to engage with us?
I think you're right. I think that I think it would be pretty boring if you didn't. And I suppose one of the things with the City of Sydney is that we're very clear about not censoring the work that we support. And so often, there has been moments when proposals have come through and they're slightly different to what they were funded to do in the first instance, not from Gallery 4A. And they're conversations that you have with each other. And I suppose, we build a relationship with the people that we support at the city, and we have those conversations. So for things aren't necessarily a surprise. I see 4A's role as needing to be a challenger. You need to challenge the way people think. I still heard people only last week be quite surprised to hear that we would actually be considered to be part of the Asia-Pacific Rim. That always amazes me, completely amazes me. So why not be there in front of people to challenge how we see Asia, what is Asian culture, can we participate, we being non-Asians, in Asian culture? The city's had, we've been doing the Chinese New Year Festival now for nearly 21 years. So we've had a long history of working with that community. And I think it's that community connection that Stephen's talking about is really critical. You can't just be there producing things without acknowledging where you are, what your role is in that community.
I guess I would say, to add to that, I don't necessarily experience 4A as a overtly, explicitly political place. Asian Artists Against Racism notwithstanding, I don't experience 4A's exhibition program as like that. And indeed, I would think that for myself as a teacher, that type of position in the classroom I would think would be inappropriate in a certain way. I certainly think that I am politicized at some level in the classroom, but not in a sort of express overt way. For me, I think that I was thinking about this anecdote, and this seems like as good a place to share it as anyway. Somewhere along during the Greats exhibition last year at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, the show from the National Museum of Scotland, someone posted on Facebook a photo of an art historian who won't be named because I can't remember who it was, because I didn't know who it was at the time, standing in front of, I believe, of Velasquez, saying, and apparently his sort of pitch line for his little gallery talk at that moment, sorry, that was too sort of diminishing. His pitch line for this painting was, is this the greatest painting that has ever been shown in Australia? And at one level, I guess I was sort of recognized that was a statement that came from a place of cultural cringe. But on the other hand, even just speaking from a historical Chinese paintings perspective, which is how I've been taught, I thought, you don't even know that there was a show about a decade ago called Fantastic Mountains at the Art Gallery of New South Wales from the Nanjing Museum that was filled with unbelievable painting. The Gongxian hand scroll in that was the best painting. The problem that I had was that question didn't even allow for the possibility, didn't even see the possibility that the best painting that had ever been seen in Australia might not be a European work of oil on canvas. And so for me, I guess that I would say that the anti-racism part of art history for me starts with showing up every day and trying to talk as eloquently and as sort of as well informed as I can about whatever art, whatever Asian art, since I'm the lecturer, but whatever art that I'm working on. And to me, that's what 4A really does. More than being explicitly political, first and foremost, you're political by creating a space in which this occurs and staking out that space in a sort of deliberate fashion. So I don't see that as sort of incompatible with, I mean, you didn't say it was incompatible with the city's ideas, but I wouldn't have seen it that way anyway.
No. I guess for us, we think about, we do lots of acquittals and lots of grant writing to other people's strategies.
Not anymore. Our chairman this morning said I could just write, "Dear Australia Council, time is the ultimate judge." That's what I'm doing now. It's from the top. Sorry, Michaela. You've been overruled. My workload just halved.
With the city with Alex, the conversation we've had with you, and we're excited about our area so much that we renamed it already as SOGO, which is South of Golden Street.
SOGO, that's fantastic.
So in terms of a precinct and ideas, we feel really active in this area, and we feel like even in terms of teaching, and I come from an academic teaching background as well, is that Foray is about creating opportunities. I think the basis of what we do with things like the Beijing Studio Program, free artists going to Beijing every year, Creators Intensive every second year, bringing leading creative space within the wider Asia region to Australia to train the very best in the emerging talent in Australia. And then now recently, Kejo with the writers program, opportunities are kind of what we want to make for Australians in Asia. You cannot be a really successful contemporary Australian artist if you're not engaged with it. I think with the launch of Foray Papers, we discussed a lot about this and what this opportunity means for writers as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, look, politics is a word that describes the game, sometimes a dirty one. I mean, I would prefer to use, say, responsibility, which describes a duty. So, what is the Foray Papers? It's a platform to publish writing, all sorts of writing, critical writing, interviews with artists. It's a platform for Foray to be responsive. Someone's going to Tehran, to Jogja, why don't we show some of that? We take it as a given. We do this for a living, have studio visits, go to some pretty exciting places, see some pretty amazing things. Unless you're kind of in this art world bubble of friends on Facebook, there are a lot of people that are really interested in that sort of stuff and don't get to see it. So, it's really easy to kind of put that stuff online in a sophisticated way, as well as have much denser, incredible pieces, including one by John von Sturmer, who blessed me this week. He's I was going to put the modesty aside, John, but it's an incredible piece. So please look up John's piece. But I mentioned responsibility because, when I was telling a friend, they said, "Oh, are you in the is Foray in the business of that now?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And they said, "Well, you're going to have critical writing like on the website, what if you don't agree with it? What if someone else doesn't agree with it?" And I just found it bizarre because we're doing that anyway. I mean, we put on programs, we curate exhibitions. A point of view is implicit in that, a curatorial point of view, the way, I mean, this is 101, I don't need to explain this in this room. By editing a collection of papers, which you may or may not agree with, I mean, it's not about putting rubber seals on writers' points of views, although there's another responsibility with that, is already our bread and butter business. And I think it's really important to do because outside of, paywalls of academic journals, these things are disappearing, as John Young mentioned. I mean, I'm very passionate about it. It's kind of an idiotic enterprise. I don't know why I do it. That, writing, it pays nothing. You're up till 4 a.m. Sometimes you feel like you're having a stroke. You don't know why you do it, and it's rare to have feedback. But you sort of have to do it if you're a writer, I suppose. And I mean, look, here's the deal. There's not many platforms left. In this country, there's Broadsheet, which has been published since the 1970s by the Contemporary Arts Centre of South Australia, or an organisation which may not exist next year due to Australia Council funding. This is an incredible magazine who's published everyone from Ian Millis back in the 70s, some really hard-hitting takedowns of Mike Parr and other people. It's incredible stuff to read. Through to, I've been publishing that magazine for the last few years. Incredible people around Asia in particular and the Middle East. Over 10 years, Alan Cruikshank has focused on the Middle East and has incredible perspectives from that region. There's Magazine, also out of Melbourne, which has more experimental writing, more opportunities for emerging writers. I mean, we know most of these platforms. They're kind of it in terms of pushing the boundaries. Of course, there's magazines like Art Monthly and Artist Profile, etc., and they have their place and they're fantastic, but they're not going to publish the kind of piece that we've just published by John von Sturmer. So, we're talking about a booze bill. This Foray Papers is maybe $3,000 per issue. Which we're kind of just raising ourselves. That's not even an annual booze bill. More organisations need to be doing this.
I want to add on two points. First, everybody's talking about here politics, and I'm actually from a very, very political region, Pakistan, of course. Every time when anyone talks about politics or anything, Pakistan name is always there. But I particularly find Australian politics very tamed, very mild. And maybe Pauline Hanson is the only character that probably I think that I. But from being from a region and I do political work, I actually realize is that calling my work as just political actually undermines my own work and what I do, because politics is part of us now. If I would say that every artwork that is being created today is political, then it may not be incorrect in that sense. But when I look at 4A's model and when I work with them, I actually believe what I now actually consider my own politics is I actually create I believe in poetic activism, and I think that's what I think 4A is doing. They are not directly commenting on the politics, but they're actually bringing art and aesthetics into it. Because at the end of the day, if I want to talk about politics, then I should join a political party and then go out and do the rallies. But I think artists do it in a very poetic manner, and I think 4A understand that. The second aspect about the papers and all that, I'll give you just one example that why it is an absolutely amazing project, is that when I arrived here back in 2006 to do my MFA, and my research was about Pakistan, I went to to Kofa Library. There was only 2 books about Pakistan, and they both fall into the category of India. So they were anything related to contemporary art whatsoever. And I went and I talked about it and said, why don't you give us a list of books that you want, and we'll get those books. So the books that they have right now, which is 10 to 12 books, were recommended by me, and that's how they have those books. But the idea for a researcher, for example, later on I did my PhD, I had a very hard time even finding any kind of published papers to even quote from them, especially the area that I was investigating. And without a publication, a researcher cannot quote or write anything about it, because if it's not published, it's not a source, and you can't quote a source. And if somebody has a problem with a particular paper, then that's what it is about. You go and write another paper that actually comment on that and say, look, I have a better research, and this is how it is, because that's the only way you build knowledge. And knowledge is based on these events where somebody actually proposes an idea and somebody will come up and say, I have a better idea. So rather than saying that this is not the right way of doing it, I think it just will take you in a wrong trajectory.
I think for us, I think this sort of leads into what you're talking about. We have been spending a lot of time in the last 18 months talking about this idea of what Asia is and how we should be approaching our work and who we are talking to and what conversations we have in that space. I think I said this before. And we were lucky enough to receive funding for 5 years to really focus on extend our into South Asia. And it's been interesting that places like 4A, I think Gina and I was talking about how at the beginning of 4A there was a really big focus on the Philippines, and that's completely disappeared until this year here. For some reason there was at least one a year, and then there was nothing for more than a decade. Is this reflective of what the most urgent questions are, what the movements are, or also changes with curators and what our interests are? But I think in terms of strategy or going forward for the next 20 years, Edmund has a big push and a massive obsession with us working with Central Asia. These are places that generally within the wider Australian contemporary arts scene are not really touched upon at all. So for someone like you, Abdullah, is this offering you new opportunities, and does this change where you're thinking and talking about how you're seeing yourself as Australian now? Is this part of it?
Again, going back to the idea that why it is important for 4A or for any organization to look now at South Asia and even Middle East, is because these are the emerging markets. They have the narratives that it's not been told. And I think artwork without narratives, it's basically then you're just looking at an art object and appreciating its aesthetics and beauty, but it's not communicating the urgencies that you were talking about. And now being lived here for 10 years, and I actually consider myself partially Australian. The reason is that because I'm partially American and partially Pakistani. So I'm actually dealing with 3 different nationalities and 3 different identities at the same time. And all that, I'm also Muslim. So dealing with those identities while creating an artwork is actually challenging, and it's actually challenging for any artist who deal with any kind of multiple or hybrid identities. And I think in that sense, if you look at it, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Middle East, that the focus right now of politics, of religion discourse, or whatever, is actually at that. It's actually on them right now. I've been exhibiting more internationally than in Australia, and I travel a lot to Pakistan and as well as Middle East. And the economy that they are generating around artwork, it's incredible. And I think for Australian art market or for Australian curators and artists to reach out and to penetrate in that market, you have to have an understanding of what that art market is. And I think one of those things, which is a great example, is that when you have the curator intensive, the idea to bring curators from that particular region here, and then let them do workshops with emerging curators in Australia is actually fantastic, because a curator from here just can't go to those regions and say, I want to curate something, because you really need to know what the culture is, what they are about, there are some censorships, of course, that you can circumvent, but you need to know how you can do that. For example, there is a huge discourse, and there are a lot of misconceptions that in Pakistan you cannot exhibit nudes, or you cannot exhibit this. It's actually not true in many ways, and this is what we have learned from Zarmeena Shah, who was invited by 4A to do curative intensive, that she talks about it, that it's not a matter of whether you can exhibit nudes or not. I think it's a matter of, it's more about the politics. If you don't talk about the politics, and if you don't incite anyone politically, then the gallery is a private space. And you probably don't know this, that we actually do not have in Pakistan, we do not have any museum whatsoever. We had one museum, the government actually funded it, which is called Modern Museum of Art in Islamabad, which was opened a few years ago. And after one show, it was shut down, and now it was used for theater. So a country where there is no museum to support any kind of contemporary art, the galleries are playing a dual role. They are not only exhibiting artists' work and selling their work, but also they are playing this role where they are inviting curators and others to come and participate in publishing books and archives. So I think for a country like Australia and artists, for Australians and curators, they need to go and understand, they need to go and visit, first of all, if they can visit to these places, and then make connections. Just on the final thought, is this something I've been doing for the past 10 years, is before I actually start working with 4A on this venture, I've been taking Australian artists from here to Pakistan. And that's what I was doing through UNSW, College of Fine Arts, where I collaborated with Cicada Press, and I took Michael Kempson back to Pakistan, and we did his survey show in Pakistan, and I actually published his monograph in Pakistan. Later on, Michael Essen was taken there. He's a drawing professor, and his monograph was published there. And now they are going back and forth from here to Pakistan to teach drawing and printmaking. And they're becoming kind of godfathers of drawing and printmaking in Pakistan. And they have collectors there who love to collect their works, and they are highly regarded. And the same thing is happening now through 4A, where we are bringing artists from there and we are taking artists from here, hopefully, to open this channel. So I think it's very important that in order for us to tap into this emerging market, both artistically and economy-wise, that we have to reach out.
I might just add, to touch on the kind of question of, say, focusing on regions and why 4A or other organisations might do that, whether it's a clear kind of statement like we're doing now in terms of 5 years of a bit of a focus on South Asia, or whether sometimes it's pragmatism as well, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's not to say that it drives the agenda, but sure, you're curating a group show, there's possible money from DFAT to do something with Korea, you might consider Korean artists if it fits with your idea. That's nothing wrong with that. One thing I really admired about 4A, well before my time, so this is not about me, is, and we haven't really discussed today much at all. Of course, John brought up the important question of the place of Indigenous Australia within this discussion, but it also is the Pacific. And one thing I really admired is, particularly under Aaron's vision, was that engagement in the Pacific in our region. I mean, I remember before I started working at 4A, there was a credible show. Michaela mentioned Aaron's period of going AWOL, sort of between 2005 and 7. Before you came back to be director. He, during that time, curated a really seminal show called News from Islands in 2007, which was at Campbelltown Arts Centre, which featured Dachi. Dachi Dung's The Boat was in there. John von Sturmer wrote for the catalogue. And it was really a show for me, I think probably one of the first shows that I saw at Campbelltown Arts Centre. I also grew up in Campbelltown. So it featured artists like Dachi, Michael Tuffrey, Karen Rookie. Who else? Many, okay. Oh, you're not allowed to talk because you work for the big house now. Okay. Many artists. Dadang, yeah. And it was a really incredible show because for me, it was the first time, I don't know, ever I saw really exciting contemporary practice in Sydney from, I'm not saying it was the first time that it happened, but the first time that, my gallery going years that I saw it, particularly in the context of growing up in Campbelltown where the majority of my neighbours were Samoa and were from Tonga, etc. And to have that kind of show in Campbelltown was pretty phenomenal. And it wasn't just a show of kind of dead artworks on the wall, but I mean, it opened with this incredible performance and video work by Michael Tuffrey and a group of dancers from the Cook Island in the outdoor foyer. It was a really phenomenal show, which interestingly, a lot of the connections I think that were made across regions with artists, Neil Harry, etc. Years later, institutions that now Aaron works for, Quagoma, started to then replicate at things like APT, etc. So, I think under Aaron's directorship in particular, that sort of curatorial engagement of our place in the Pacific, Asia's place in the Pacific, stemming from Aaron's own personal background of ethnic Chinese history that comes out of New Guinea and other places, is really important history and context that often doesn't get a run, and that I think we have a good track record of.
I think I just want to add to that as a slight side note, but if we've been going through these archives and we've put together a past staff list, and we've gone through this past staff list or people that have been on the board, it's an amazing amount of critical thinkers and people who play active roles within the contemporary arts now who've gone on from 4A, whether it's Natalie, Art Guide New South Wales, Aaron at Goma, Melissa and now the Smithsonian, it have come through 4A. So it's fostering this kind of critical thought or talent that I hope doesn't just extend to staff members, but also is happening for the curatorial intensive dream curatorial team, as they call themselves, to interns that come work with us for a 3-week project or something like that. I really feel that the kind of discussions, in our tiny office where we all sit within this far of each other, when the conversation's heated, it's heated, and even if you're sitting in the corner, you're involved. And I think that kind of discussion or debate is really, really important, and I think is probably, I was very happy to
Portuguese, I talk with my hands.
Pedro always stands, as soon as he stands up, you're like, here goes half an hour. But it is a conversation I think I inherited from Aaron, this space that is about really asking the questions. Nothing slips by. Everything is interrogated. And I think as part of that, one of the conversations that we ask ourselves, and I was really interested that Jackie asked the previous panellists, is she asked them, who do you think your audience is? And now and then we have this question of who do we think our audience is? And I would just like to hear from you guys about who do you think the audience is for 4A? Are there audiences? Because this really influences how we work, because we're constantly trying to figure out how to play this, or how to be inclusive, but how to also respond to certain community groups. When we have an exhibition of a certain artist, certain groups will turn up. And how do we engage them past just this one show? It's a really big question.
I guess I'll start by saying, because this gives me an opportunity to talk a little bit about how I envision Power's partnership with 4A as opposed to my own partnership as a university lecturer. I have been thinking Power is an organization that that from its founding was very much oriented towards European modernism, because Power, the founder, was himself an Australian who traveled to Europe and was very close with European modernists. And I think that I've been very fortunate and been offered a wonderful opportunity to be sort of charged with the opportunity to expand that remit to look at Asian art and to include Asian art. And so the reason I say that is because the answer to what I hope that we can bring to each other in a partnership moving forward is, separate from who your audiences are, it's who your audiences might be. I am very cognizant that or it appears to me that not just in Australia but in many places that audiences for art are very segregated. Certain people go to European painting shows, and certain people go to shows of Asian art, and certain people go to 4A. And what I would really like to see is how partnerships can begin to expand and press on those audiences so that more and more people are seeing Asian art within a sort of much broader conversation about art. That Asian art doesn't, why I don't want to sort of minimize the types of conversations we were having earlier today about what it means to be a Asian Australian artist and how that is, for some people, a distinctive identity and for some people not. I also want to advocate for more and more people saying, this is contemporary art. This is not just a sort of series of segregated realms within art. So I don't know who precisely your audiences are, but I know that I'd like to sort of support their expansion, however I can.
I think that's right. For the city, the city has 200 different nationalities living just in our small LGA, and it is a very small LGA compared to Western Sydney. And so for us, it's always, the primary focus for us is who's walking past your front door, who is in your front yard, and don't lose awareness of who's in your front yard. And when you go down to 4A in that area, it's everybody. There is everybody, tourists, locals, workers, homeless people. There's everybody down there. And that's who I think you need to speak to in the first instance. And I think they reflect, the broader Australia and globally. I think that, it'd be nice if people didn't identify it as Asian art or European art. And I think that's what you do, because it is a far more informal setting for it's not overwhelming when you walk into that gallery. Anybody can walk in and have a look. It's less intimidating than the art gallery or the MCA. There isn't a sign above the wall that says Asian art gallery here, and turn left for the Aboriginal gallery. And I think that makes a really big difference because you're embedded in that community.
Just to add to that, from an artist's perspective, I think as an artist, even if you have any kind of traditional background, for example, in miniature painting or something, I think today's the artwork that you're making is contemporary at the end of the day, because you're mixing in different hybrid models and different techniques. But I think as an artist, because I'm doing just that, and I'm also not living in my own country, I actually encountered this audience issue directly. And it happens when I went back from the States, where I actually studied art, to Pakistan, and I had my first show. And I remember nothing got sold, nothing at all. Everybody really liked it and whatever. But one of the art critics came to me and say that, you don't live here, don't you? And I said, no, I don't live here. I said, so when is your next show? I said, I really don't know. And later on, one of my friends actually told me that your work, people would not buy it because they don't see you as their own. They have to see you as their own before they can start collecting your work. And because you don't live here, you haven't invested any time here in this audience or for the audience, even you're not teaching here, you don't have any godmother or godfather or an institution part of that, then it's very difficult for you to generate your audience. And the audience is just not the people who look at your work, it's also for us as an artist, it's also who collect your work, who write about your work, or who promote your work. Those are our audiences, and they are broader. But despite the fact, whatever happens, the audience, the word even audience remains very narrow. We have to go beyond that idea of audience and then see how we can expand the art to just general public. And I think it only happens when, for example, when there is a renowned artist, a well-known artist who everybody knows, for example, a Picasso show, then people generally say, let's go to Picasso because I know his or her, his name. And I want to go and see, I want to pay $20 and then see what Picasso is all about. And I think that level or that echelon is very different for the audience than the audience for 4A. And I think it will be a challenging task to find the audience beyond what you already have.
Yeah, I have to get my 2 cents in on audience. I've sat around more tables and meetings and all sorts of assessments where I've been invited probably as a token culturally and linguistic diverse kind of feedback respondent. About the question of audience, 2 things I know for sure. Anyone with the title Audience Development Officer at a big institution is guaranteed the person at the institution who's most removed from something called an audience, right? They tend to live in Potts Point and wouldn't know how to drive to Western Sydney if they had to. The second thing... The second thing is... what is the second thing? The second thing is the elephant in the room, which we often talk about, like culturally and linguistic diversity, all of that, ethnic diversity, racial diversity, etc. But I think, which John Clark brought up, is really a question of social class as well, which people don't really want to talk about with audience. I mean, what we do at 4A, it's all for free. The only thing it's going to cost you is money, right? I mean, it's time. But time... Give money too, we're having a fundraiser. The only thing it's going to cost you is, like I said, 3 a.m. The only thing it's going to cost you is time, but time costs money because, and this is a problem for all, I think, arts and culture. We're all struggling with, all of us, even people in this room that are so passionate about art, you're probably seeing less exhibitions and less things in the flesh than you were 5-10 years ago because we live such busy lives. So I think it's a real issue that is really shifting not just the visual arts but all sorts of other cultural production. And so on that issue, I think it's also, you do need to look at that question because there's actually a lot of engagement with cultural products and cultural entertainment and stuff in Western Sydney, to take an example, because it seems to be everyone's favourite kind of phantom of big audiences being such a big proportion of Sydney. They're just not interested in your culture. I mean, there's rappers called Cursor, a young rapper from Minto who has like a million, 2 million YouTube subscribers. This is a kid in Minto. He's got the kind of appeal online that, an institution could only dream of. There's South Asian and Indian communities in Campbelltown that go to, concerts of local pop stars and stuff all the time. I mean, you speak to any kind of multicultural organisation marketing person or audience development officer, and, it's a whole other game. And I just think that the big end of town institutions that are just thinking about, this is our product, how do we get people to engage with our product without the product actually having representation. I've always said there's no engagement without representation.
I think you touched on something there as well, where it's not necessarily about the physically walking into the building. It's what's online, it's the platform papers are going to bring hopefully a broader audience to you. It's your presence digitally that's going to expand the punters, if you want to call them, audience members. The audience members can be all sorts of people in the city, and it's beyond the city. So I think it's that digital platform that's going to be pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, I think for us, and you spoke about it earlier, when people do come from international, they're like, 4A is like one room. And I'm like, yes. And think the expectations of what we do are from a place that's much more fancy. But I kind of like that. And I think even if we do grow, it will still keep that same feeling about it is a welcoming space. It's somewhere that you don't need to be quiet. I think that it means it's impossible to be quiet in the Haymarket. So that's good. My final question before I open it up is one that I find quite fascinating. I think, Steve, you started to bring it up before, is the idea of quarantining Asian art to one place. And whether 4A actually, should we be at 40 disbanding because we are just contemporary, and within Australian culture, it's seen as culture. It's not seen as having to be marked as something else. Do you think it's...
Well, you know, I can only... The answer to that question that I've been thinking about, actually I was sort of struck by Lindy's comment this morning that we were sort of trapped in a generational cycle, that every generation was going to have to rediscover Asia because every generation wasn't sort of learning anything. There was no sort of progress and development, and my response to that question or that comment, first of all, comes from a place of very different sort of ethnic reality, which I am aware of, and also a different national reality, but also sort of a deep hope that that's not true, that we are slowly making progress. I was very struck when I moved here that people talked about Australia as part of the West. And as someone who works on sort of Orientalism and post-Orientalism, I was already naturally very attuned to the question of what it meant to be the West. But then I thought, oh my God, now we have really just reduced the West to white Europeanness. So I hope that we are moving towards a place where Australia is much more part of its geographic reality as well as its ethnic reality or its sort of immigrant reality, and part of its indigenous reality, that's all sort of more balanced. So all of that is to say that if 4A is seen as a place whose sort of raison d'etre emerged in the Pauline Hanson moment, then yeah, like at some level, yeah, I hope in 20 years 4A isn't necessary. At the same time, you know, thinking about audience and the sort of geographic difference between the people walking by and the people in Western Sydney, 4A is a very vibrant part of a very vibrant but also rapidly changing community, and I hope that doesn't change. And so there's a part of me that also says, no, I hope that 4A is just sort of evolved into a series of new challenges and new ideas in 20 years, not somehow become irrelevant. Even though that sort of irrelevant or that obsolescence would in some sense be success. Exactly right, yeah.
I think the fact that you call yourself Gallery 4A has already evolved. You're not the Asian Australian Artist Association. It's Gallery 4A, so you don't need to remind people constantly what your purpose is. I think people understand what the purpose is, and I think it would be sad if it didn't exist anymore, because I like the focus. I think the focus is really needed, because I think we're always going to have people who don't understand what our place is globally. I think that's just the way it is, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I'm less measured. I would say it's absolutely needed. You know, I mean, take a look around. You know, do your own audit of boards. You know, when it comes to the question of Indigenous representation, Asian, linguistically, culturally diverse, women, go to some websites, do your own audit of board members, do your own audit of senior management, not just cultural organisations, universities, etc. You know, it's needed.
May I ask, what is 4A?
You should have been here this morning.
I know, I'm sorry.
It's the Asian Australian Artists Association, is our original name. Come on, what did you do?
No, but I'm aware of that. But I was actually thinking that the 4A is 4 axis. You know, that it's all axis that is compassing it. So that's how I was thinking.
Well, that's nice.
Confirm it. So I actually think that 4A, I don't think in the next 20 years 4A will stick to just Asia. because I think we have no idea how the politics is going. If Trump becomes president, who knows that we will have this world or not remains. It's one continent. Maybe this will only one continent remains. But what I'm saying is that I think the way that it's progressing, and even the artists, the way that they are making artwork in Asia, there's so much influence of Western artwork in Asian artwork in Western. So I think the lines are delineating, I think, in terms of that, and I think eventually the foray will bring that sort of hybridity in their model as well. So I don't think that 4A can be just for Asia. It can be for 4 axes that can go wherever you want to go. And maybe eventually you will have 4 different models playing in 4 different places. Who knows?
Doing our strategy for us.
Like in Pakistan.
Like in Pakistan, of course. I'm happy to run that if you want.
Get the name right first.
I think at this point, you probably have some questions that you would like to ask. I mean, this is a pretty amazing group of people that are very much invested in our future. So, any questions from the group? John, coming down. She's coming.
Yeah, I don't want to sound querulous because, but it's a very typical sort of problem. I mean, my own orientation to the world is nothing means anything unless I can envisage it in the future. Where is it taking us? And I haven't heard that. So where's the space of imagination? I mean, it's terribly important in terms of, in my own personal case, it's one of the rare places where I can write close to how I might want to write, for example. So that's very important. It's odd that the other side has to do with post-colonial studies, so that linkage. But this is a very censorious country, and it's on the Aboriginal scene. There's a lot of censorship going on in what people can produce or what they can't. I might want to come back to that in a different connection. But taking seriously the next 20 years, what are the sorts of assumptions that are informing you, or what do you think, where do you think things are going? What do you think are going to be the determinative processes in the world? And so instead of turning it into history as a past, as it were, what's the history as it might be in the future? I know that it seems so simple as an orientation, but it's something I have great trouble getting out of people. You know, the meaning of things isn't, the past is already gone. What's going on now, and where is it taking us to?
I mean, I think in terms of what we discuss at 4A about what we think we should be, you know, what histories should be written or what histories or conversations should we be shepherding, it is a discussion that's come back, I think, in the last few months and through numerous sort of internal meetings, is about we think we should be reflecting who is coming and becoming part of Australia. There has been our history, and our history is informing our future in terms of who we think and who we should be engaging and what stories we should be telling are the Australian stories that are maybe the harder stories or the not so heard or visible. We come back to the idea of visibility again, but they may shift. And I think Abdul and everyone talked about it in the previous session, is that are we shifting now to questions of religion with this question about, you know, his Muslim identity so much, he feels that or he identifies with that so much more than his Asian Australian identity, if you want to call it that. So are we shifting and having to respond to these bigger things that even though they're happening far away as part of this sort of global interconnected organisation, and I think we very much operate on that level, we do need to be responding to these things. And in this sort of age, what we're calling the post-truth politician, we need to be making sure that we're able to rebut these things before they're even spoken, I guess.
And I think that's one of 4A's advantages, is that it's nimble. And unlike the larger institutions that take a while to turn and to change, you can respond. You can respond tomorrow to something, even though you've got something else planned coming down in the week. And I think that's the thing that I would hate to see 4A lose, the nimbleness.
I think predicting 20 years from now or talking about what's going to happen, for me, it reminds me what happened at 9/11, and after that how everything shifted and everybody talking, and for the next 10 years this one incident start talking about the Islam and Muslims and all that. And I think it's a cyclical thing. Before that there's someone else. And I see that because in Australia, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I actually, when I talk to my Australian mates and whatever, I realize is that the trauma that I've gone through and then my family gone through, the migration and all that, the Australian in general does not have that particular strong sense of those traumas, I think. I mean, for example, there is no major earthquake here, there's no major, thank God there's, those sort of a thing. So I think that the migrant who's coming in, I mean, if you really want something to go by, the migrant who's coming in, they're bringing all those traumas and stories. And I think that the writers and the curators and the artists, I'm only staying within the art world, would be actually dealing with those issues for the next whatever the years until another trauma happens or something would happen that will shift your gear. So predicting next 20 years as a streamlined fashion is actually very problematic. I don't think that it can be done that way.
I'll have to stick to my guns on this, that the meaning of now can't be interpreted retrospectively. It's what it leads to. And you're adopting a certain position, if I can say that, to say there can be no prediction. It disturbs me a little bit to think that trauma becomes the guiding notion. I mean, what I would think the difficulty in Australia, just me, is the extraordinary blandness of the society. So what are you going to do about that, as it were? And it seems to me that there are strategies one can engage. One thing I did in the Aboriginal world was getting people to paint things that they deal with in their normal lives, like shopping at KFC. Because what I was interested in is discovering the mechanisms that people used to translate their experience through painting. Now we can learn the sorts of tropes and moves and whatever that people are actually informing their art practice, rather than some little scabby story, the porcupine fell over or something or other, and this is the dreaming place. We've actually seen how people actually construct their images and why and how. Now it seems to me that could be the one of the values of an encounter with Asia, is actually taking people's artistic practices seriously and feeding those into here to see how Australia can be represented through those mechanisms, or whatever we're going to call them. For example, the other thing I would add into this is the notion that you might have things from 4A hosted in other parts of Sydney. For example, so taking things out to people or getting people to serve as the host and therefore the promoters of the sorts of things that you're interested in promoting.
Yeah, and that's on the agenda. We're going to increasingly be doing things, pop-ups and other sort of initiatives in regional areas. So not just Sydney, but regional New South Wales and other states. But I mean, look, it's a big question, John. I mean, I'm not David Harvey, so I'm not going to tackle it. But I will say, if you want to talk about now, Sydney now, Melbourne now, I mean, we heard from John Young, Melbourne now is 3 Asian visual artists in a group of 387. So in terms of what we might want the future, what do we envisage as the future? Advocacy is a hugely important role that this organisation has done over 20 years, and it would always be a role, but I would like to see it be a lesser role, the implication being that we need less of it because there's been enough of a paradigm shift where we don't have to have this kind of explicit agenda because things have changed and representation has changed. I mean, that's what I think we work towards.
And I guess that I would only add that, obviously I come to this conversation as explicitly a teacher, but I see the activities of the teacher and the curator of the art history teacher and the curator is in many ways analogous. And I guess that, to borrow at least a notion from or wording from American teaching, and maybe it translates well to Australia, I see the role of the teacher as creating citizens. And by citizens, I mean informed, open-minded, engaged, active members of society who are respectful of certain, I mean, for me, democratic values. I'm not trying to spruik American democracy on the 5th of November or any day, but you know what I mean? Like, I'm a little bit, I understand the point you're trying to make, but as a scholar, as an art historian, I'm backward looking, but as a teacher, I'm only forward looking. And as a curator, I'm only forward looking because ultimately the goal is, for me, is sure, it's what happens in the classroom or in the gallery that I care about, but I care much, much more about what happens when you leave the gallery. I care much more about how you take whatever you've experienced in that space out into the world and deal with everything around you, hopefully differently in some regard. And so, you know, like as Pedro says, like, you know, hopefully, in some sense, that's less and less needed because it's more and more successful. But also, I think that arts education remains forever vital to us, and arts engagement remains forever and vital.
Well, first of all, congratulations, everybody. I've just arrived, but I've been associated with the neighbourhood, if I could use that very local government word, of Pyrmont since 1984. So on and off, Gallery 4A has actually been my local gallery for a long time. One of the reasons why I'm enjoying this conversation is because it is a very expansive and very inclusive conversation. But I thought I'd like to turn and ask you this question. Within your mission and your parameters, you must have processes whereby you're talking about actually not doing certain things, particularly because the wider cultural and artistic landscape of Australia is changing. And it's obvious that the discourses and concerns that you have are now reflected in other organisations and initiatives across Australia. So could you tell us, through your different associations with the organisation, about some of the processes by which you might decide not to do something, or the way in which you might be thinking about the order to do something?
I can probably respond to that one. In terms of 4A has no processes. We're creative people. It is very much an urgency to do something rather than the need to not do something. I think we have conversations less about not doing something than about how we have to do something in particular. And for us, I think this year I spent a lot of time in Pakistan. I spent a lot of time in Jogja. So the things that came out of that were things that were in our faces. I mean, Pedro came back from China with these things, and next year when we're working within India, I'm sure it will be the same again. So it is through the active encountering and research that we find what we feel we need to respond to. And those research trips are informed by research done on the ground here into what things we think are gaps or need to be addressed here, that then sort of get amplified through trips. So it's never, I don't think it's ever a question of what we don't do. It's a question of what we need to do.
Particularly now. I mean, you know that, Jasmine. I mean, what we, in terms of the implication being we're not going to do something because it's already being done. Well, there's things that were being done for a very long time by the likes of AsiaLink and other organisations which pretty soon might not be done, right, because of funding. So it's not really a question of what don't we do.
It's not that I would condone such a thing that 4A not do things, but you can't do everything. And so...
and if you stay up till 3 in the morning.
That you and it's also important that you don't, because I think... and I'm sure you've spoken about this in other sessions, but there are people, and some of them do work in audience development in other institutions and projects around Australia, who are also urgently wanting to be involved in the kind of research and priorities that you are. So, of course you're going to do everything. You're an incredible team, but you can't do everything. So how do you decide?
I don't think we do everything. I think that's the first thing that needs to be said. And I think also what Edmund said opening this morning, when the MCA opened for the Art Gallery of New South Wales, that was the best news. The more the merrier. And I think, AsiaLink when it began, 4A when it began, there were gaps. And we have pivoted so many times since then because the urgency of other things have come up, or conversations are thankfully becoming mainstream and Australian conversations as opposed to Asian // Australian conversations. So I don't think it's a question of not doing things or whether we can do everything. It's whether it's us deciding what we think are the conversations that we want to push in our space as the ones we think are critical right now.
And also just the reality of time and parameters. You know, we have a fabulous building. We have a commitment to the city to have that building open. We have a commitment to the artists to have exhibition opportunities, to have that place as a hub. Therefore, we can only do so much on top of that, which we always do. You know, I mean, yeah, it's. But yeah.
But I think the priorities they surface. The priorities surface naturally, either as a shock or a punch to the face, or naturally they rise because of the strength of whatever argument it is. I mean, it is interesting at the city. I've always worked in, federal government arts funding, state government arts funding. Our issue at the city is that we don't have enough time to do everything that we want to do. And so we do have to make decisions on what do we do first. And it's always, always dictated by what does the community want? What is the priority for the community? Always. And we would be shot down if we didn't do that. It would be, we've got a very vocal small community. But I think it's, things bubble to the surface, but it is that nimbleness. It's that 4A has, that it can decide to change course and approach a topic or an issue or an artist very quickly. One of the other things with 4A, no pressure, but there aren't a lot of organisations left like 4A in the sort of, we're in Sydney or even Greater Sydney, those small to medium spaces that can respond and create extraordinary opportunity on a dime. It's very small budgets. The city had 25, 30 artist-run initiatives only 10 years ago. I think we've got about 6 or 8 left. And that is a huge deficit just in our local government area. And we feel that. And so that's why we're very passionate to try and maintain 4A's presence in our city. And we know that cultural organisations are growing broadly across, just in New South Wales, we've got an incredible wealth of organisations. But, Greater Sydney needs those dialogues, and I think they naturally come to the fore.
Hello. Paptawan again. Now, I want to reflect on the issue about the audience, who is the audience for 4A. As from my experience, I am an artist, but I am also a mother, and my 2 children are part of this culture, Australian. My exhibition, when I promoted my exhibition in 4A, I worked with the community, the Thai community, and the consulate. He was surprised to know that Thai language was the 3rd largest community language outside English, which within Sydney CBD, and my audience came from there. But that's not the issue. The issue is, the point is, I also work with the community language school where my 2 children went. Now, they grow out of the school. But within that community language school, I've got a lot of issue on the identity of this 2nd generation or 3rd generation of the Thai Australian born, and many of whom wanted to pursue art career and they don't identify, so I said, I addressed to them, I said, do you know 4A? And that's where you go, and that's where maybe you can start the project from, it's what I guess what I am saying is there is community-based, a platform for community, and for not only for this generation but the next generation who wanted to deal with the issue of what already has been doing, and the location of 4A within the, community base is, I think that's the way to go from my experience. That's what I wanted to share.
Francis.
Francis, can you?
I was wondering if you can comment on the audience and the place of Asian Australian art within the discipline of art history itself, and how Asian Australian art practice transforms the way we understand not just the history but the very idea of Australian art in ways that is still unrecognized within the discipline of art history. Like I've been to a number of conferences organized by the Art Association of Australia and New Zealand. I've convened panels in those conferences, including one with Michaela, and generally speaking, their program tends to be quite Eurocentric in its framing and in its content. And so I'm just wondering how you see the kind of future partnership that you envisage between Power and 4A in helping transform or change or reconfigure the discourse around what constitutes Australian art itself, and how the contributions of Asian artists in Australia would, can be seen as integral to it.
Thank you. That's a really good and really important question. And I want to try to do it some justice. Let me start with a sort of very brief analogy. So as I said, my research is primarily on 18th century art right now, 17th and 18th century art, so early modern art. And one of the recent trends in early modern art has been to look at global movement of objects and ideas and people. And some people see that as, I think, sort of expanding the discourse past European art and sort of a Eurocentric history of the early modern world. And I guess that I would frame it slightly differently, in the sense that I would say the Eurocentric history we've been telling ourselves about the early modern world was just wrong. We got it wrong. And we now need to rewrite not a more, in a sense, not a decentered history of art or culture, but a recentered, a multi-centered history of art. It is true, Australian art is obviously in art history departments in this country is both very Eurocentric and very sort of European looking, and very interested in styles that were learned in Europe. I'm not telling you all anything you don't already know, but that we're sort of very concerned with where someone came from and when they came to Australia, and they're sort of passing through Australia makes them Australian, but it still remains a sort of hugely European practice and a very, very heavily taught practice, from which my experience of Asian Australian art is that it's very... it's not even just marginalized, it's basically absent. I mean, you teach it, but we don't teach it here at Sydney, and we need to. And so I guess that I would say that the challenge for us is not saying how do we sort of get Asian Australian art into the syllabus, into the curriculum, but how do we grapple with the idea that we've gotten Australian art wrong, and we need to rethink what falls within the broad umbrella of art making in Australia as a sort of taught and studied practice. And then how does that pressure, how in turn does that pressure the things we already thought we knew, while also sort of expanding that range of material? Does that make sense? And I don't mean, and again, and I say that within the context, sort of thinking back to what I said earlier, I don't mean to sort of in any way diminish something that certain artists or certain art historians or certain many that may be sort of special or distinct about Asian Australian art, because it reflects distinct experiences within Australian history or in Asian American history that need also to be central to that sort of telling and that understanding. But that's how I guess that I understand the sort of dismantling of the Eurocentrism that has dominated not just Australian art, but American art, and sort of lots and lots of arts that have been essentially Eurocentric histories within actually quite diverse societies. Does that sort of, yeah, maybe others have something to say.
I think I would also add in there, it's a reflection of the funding of universities and the fact that they've casualised a lot of teaching. So the people and the positions, people have not moved for some of the art historical positions in some universities across the whole of Australia for a very long time. And those people are not comfortable working outside their expertise. So they just don't. And as part of that, the conversation has not expanded, and I don't think it's because there is no want by the students or there is no talent within the country to teach it. It's just there's no positions that allow people to develop those sorts of classes to be on the syllabus as a paid full-time job.
And so just to follow on that, and then let others, we have a responsibility when, not to say anything about any specific colleagues, when we have openings in Australian art, let's say, we have a responsibility to change who we hire, to think about new fields, new disciplines. We must decide to hire people with either more diverse training or more diverse interests in what they're prepared to teach, whatever that is. We cannot continue to just sort of double down on a history that is taught and understood as a Eurocentric history, I don't think.
But also, I mean, Francis, whilst I totally appreciate your question, you already know the answer. I mean, you do your job. You're a scholar, you're a researcher. You have yourself written about projects that 4A has produced, not just things like Edge of Elsewhere, but other projects, which is your job, because you're also an art historian. I'm not. There's at least 3 people on this panel that have PhDs, and I'm a 2-time art school dropout, going on 3 times if I'm not careful, which is serious, yeah.
3 a.m.
Still not costing me anything, which is good. But in all seriousness, I'm not in the business of that, Stephen mentioned, that I'm hostile to the academy, which I'm not. He knows we're being, playful. But what I certainly am is, let's be honest, I find art history, not Stephen excluded, and also Thomas Burgess, his predecessor, which has something to do with the fact that I know they both grew up listening to Public Enemy, it can be an easy wind-up. It's an easy wind-up for me, and I love having fun with it and being playful with it because it's such a conservative field, and that's something that's certainly with what I like to see in writing. I don't care if you have an MFA or a PhD, I care how you express yourself and your ideas and so forth, which I think is, explicit in the 4A papers. I don't really think it's our role to assess history in the way an art historian does. That's your job, and you do that, and we do our job with artists.
I quite like the idea of A4, not as A, 4A is for access.
We just underwent a rebrand last night.
I'm getting affected by the 3 a.m. syndrome. Could I just go back to Pamela's comment earlier on about being an artist, really? She was talking about being an artist as the first and foremost. So I would like to think that arts transcends borders and time and politics go beyond that. So it's quite exciting to see 4A provides. Well, I'd like to see 4A to continue to provide that space for the artist to be artist, to just present their artistic impression of the world they live in, and if there's any cultural or if there's any ethnicity, the characteristics or heritage that come through their creation, and that really is quite important in a sense of it provides that level of authenticity I would think, is quite attractive, and that would be the promotional point or marketing point, if you like, to the society we're living, that we promote artists and how they see the world, see the society they're living.
I mean, I think that I think we definitely, first and foremost, support artists and their vision. I would say 75, perhaps 80% of the work we've shown this year is commissioned new work. And I feel that that's something very special that happens at 4A, that we meet artists. We work with them sometimes for a long time before we commission them to make something, and sometimes there's support. Sometimes actually some artists I work with I've never shown, but I have probably been to their studio 4 or 5 times a year. I think the support that we do is not necessarily, I mean, Abdul, I think I see like every day, is about a different kind of support. And I think sometimes 4A, and not just us, I think at Artspace and at every other artistic organisation should be supporting and does support artists. And I feel that not all of it results in an exhibition. Some of it does, but some happens in many different ways.
If I add to that, I think the 4A is one of those institutions that actually not just supporting artists, but allowing them to become entrepreneurs themselves, you know, to take charge of their own art practices, to take wherever they want to go. Because I can make my artwork, but if I can't take it outside, and if I don't know how to take that outside to find visibility or define the audience, then it will remain in my studio, which is fine. I mean, I'm happy, but I can't live with that. You know, I have to find those audiences, and I think 4A is allowing me, particularly in my case, actually allowing me to be more vocal. Just give you an example that after my PhD, it took me 1 year to submit my PhD document because I was going through what call it imposter syndrome. And actually I had to have a chat with her. And then she simply said, just do it because I did it and all that. And next thing you know, the next day I submitted it. And so that it may not give you much here, but just having a voice there where you can call, a professional voice where you can call them and say, look, I have this problem. Can you give me some insight? And the assurance that you hear, the voice, the authority, that it allows you to say, yes, I actually needed to hear that, or maybe not, I mean, in that sense. But I think Michaela and I'm actually working with Pedro right now because Pedro is writing for my first monograph, and I'm actually probably have a very hard time discussing my artwork with him for 1 year, you know. But I think all of that will come back to me at the end of the day as an artist, what I want and what I want to get out of from them. And I think that is very important because they allow that to happen. And not many organizations actually allow that. They have their own agendas and they want you to fit in. But here they are saying, we are here, you fit us in your agenda. So I find that very humbling and very exciting.
Yeah, I might just be quick, and that includes boring stuff. You know, just yesterday I spent an hour on the phone with an artist who was going overseas with an insurance question. You know, tell me what you know about personal injury and public liability insurance, of which I know something. And I was like, this is what you need to do, you know, and that's kind of the advice that we give as well.
I just want to add to Francis's sort of question, actually, in a way, and what Stephen actually said. I think it's absolutely important that there's a sort of a simultaneous development in a sense of the presence of Asian Australian in the arts and in history and so on and so forth. My own personal history was that, you know, I did about 3 years worth of research on the history of the Chinese to do projects on these people, and I discovered that there were all these sort of like Chinese Australian historians coming out of the woodworks that I've never ever heard of before, you know, who since then I've become really good friends with. But there was this huge study of people there. And my first question was, why isn't Chinese Australian history, which started in 1840, be part of a chapter in Australian studies when it's, for example, presented, you know, in Hong Kong or wherever, there's Australian Studies Department in Hong Kong, it's never presented, you know. So in that sense, I really feel that what Stephen was just saying about the reinvention of that story is very important, but I feel that what Fatawan said about her children was also very important in the sense that if you don't have this simultaneous development, people don't have a sense of confidence that whatever they're doing has justification in a way, you know. And so because of that, they just go on the sort of the now, you know, which is what the whole culture of distraction encourages us to do.
Well, it comes back to what John von Sturmer said, which is, you know, the real tragedy is there's that question, and there's the question of the wholesale inadequacy of Indigenous history in this country, you know.
I suppose the only thing to add to that, John, is that in order to reassess that art history, you also have to be able to see it. So it's impossible. I mean, it needs to be done in the context of re-looking at the collections and the national state collections, and to see the narratives that they are articulating. Because if you can't, I mean, I suppose what we're all talking about here is how do we see ourselves in the types of programming or the types of art historical narratives, and if we don't see it, it'll never change.
John, you know that you and I have had this conversation many times. I mean, I taught for 7 years in Melbourne Uni and RMIT, and I fought every year for this, and I got tired because nobody wanted to change their Section A that had to go in like 6 months before, and it was always something you had to do on the side. So if you're teaching, which I taught every year, like modernism and art, 1964 to 1860, every year, first years, is you teach that and then you hijack it and you teach other things at the same time. That's not necessarily on the syllabus, but it's in the discussion. And I think there are many people doing that, but when you look at the bits of paper and you look at the syllabus, it doesn't appear. But there are so many really great people out there who are teaching now who are doing things on the sly and making sure that First Nation stories, Asian Australian stories, contemporary stories from Africa are being told in that same breath as Picasso.
When you drop out, you can read whatever you like. Teach yourself. Write without a PhD. Call me.
But I mean, but I also think like the Aaron's point about the visibility of this is really important. I think a lot about art canons, and I think a lot about the paintings that I never knew existed because they didn't appear in the textbooks. And I thought how much my training as a painting historian was shaped by certain key collections. And then I go to see paintings in museums in storage, and I say, well, I'd really like to see this painting. And the curator says, nah, you don't want to see that. That's garbage. And you think, no, that's exactly the thing I want to see because it made it this far, and yet you think it's not important, which means that it is somehow absent from the art history or the art imagination. And so I think that the visibility, I mean, yes, you can read whatever you want, but only if we're out there supporting it, showing it, publishing it. And I don't mean to sort of make overly central the importance of the historian or the curator or the scholar. We're only part of this sort of large community, but we do need to be making those images digital. I think that's one of the things that I think is really sort of powerful about what you said about the 4A papers, is that this isn't quite open access, but it sort of really sort of democratizes the process of what we're prepared and what we're able to get out. And I think that's incredibly important.
Can I just briefly add that we have such an advantage in Australia because of our proximity in every sense of the word to the art histories that are being written in Asia, because art history in the Northern Hemisphere sense is old and established, whereas we have colleagues who are writing new histories for the first time. And I think there's a great opportunity for Gallery 4A and Power in the synergies between you and in your alliance to really lead in this issue, because I've found over the last couple of years working with art historians and curators in Asia, that they have said to me, oh, Jasmine, you're far too differential to European and American art histories. And so our immediate colleagues are really challenging us. And I think there's going to be more people in the field of art history in Australia actually keeping a bit more of an eye on this developing relationship between Gallery 4A and the power.
It's a lot of pressure, Stephen. I think on that very optimistic, and I think will be delivered, Jasmine, don't worry, note, I just want to wrap up today before our keynote in an hour and just say thank you to these amazing speakers, not just here but throughout the day. We've had a really day of big questions and I think big ideas, and I like the fact that nothing ever gets solved. And I think that's one of the things that 4A does. We don't really solve things, we just ask more questions. If you came in with a question, you're leaving with 4 more. And that's the whole point. It's an ongoing dynamic discussion. I also want to take this opportunity to thank China Studies Centre, the Asian Australian Studies Research Network, of course the Power, here at the University of Sydney. But I also want to thank, and not just because she's sitting here with me, but the City of Sydney, Arts New South Wales and the Australia Council, because they, and as you heard from the horse's mouth, they let us do things that are independent and a little bit pushy, and they don't ask us to really report on why. We really have a really long leash, and I think we're very lucky to have that. You may have also noticed over the last few weeks that our website has been updated. There's now the 4A papers. Every show that we can find information on, we have up at the moment. It's all been redesigned by our design partners at Future Brand, who have been a dream team with all of our crazy expectations. And on your way out, or if you haven't already, please pick up one of our brochures for our program for our 21st year. We're very excited about it. It reflects this new push into South Asia, but it also reflects many stories that have been familiar to 4A. Darchi's got a solo with us next year that Pedro is working closely with him, and I think it reflects a responsibility that we have to tell stories that are very important not only to us, but we think someone like Darchi should be everywhere right now. And so hopefully after next year, he will be this kind of, really seminal work that should be seen as implicit, on a first year syllabus, it should be Darchi. So we think this is really... Yeah. And lastly, if you have any questions, if you want to pitch an idea to 4A papers, if you want to ask us about our program, how to be involved or how to support us, we would love to talk to anybody about any of this sort of stuff. We've also put on some nibbles just over at Taste Baguette over here. So if you want to have a bit of a snack before coming back for the keynote, that'll be great. But thank you so much for coming today. It's been really amazing for me to listen to all these stories and see all these faces, and I hope it's been just as good as for you all. So thank you very much.